This is the Voyage Report podcast, where you get the scoop on travel. Now, the editor-in-chief of the Voyage Report, Mark Albert.
Greetings, fellow travelers, and welcome. Today, we're going to take you behind the lens of a master photographer who's captured breathtaking images for National Geographic and is a worldwide explorer. Ben Horton is a photographer and storyteller and joins us today via Skype from his home in Southern California. Ben, welcome to the Voyage Report podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, such a pleasure to have somebody of your caliber here joining us today. Let me start off with the same questions we ask all of our guests so that our listeners get a little sense of you. What has been your biggest discovery while traveling?
Man, I mean, that's a pretty tough question because there's so many things that I want to try to talk about all at once. But for me, it's just how happy I am when I'm on the road. Just leaving everything behind, the taxes, the bills, the accounting, all that stuff, and just diving into a moment and being present. I think the discovery itself would be almost saying that that's where I'm meant to be. I don't know if that's a good answer or not. It's pretty vague, but that's the happiest I'll ever be.
No, makes total sense. I've been a journalist for 20 years, and my best days are when I'm out in the field, not sitting behind a desk or anything like that, but out there in the elements or interviewing somebody or covering a story on the scene. I totally understand where you're coming from. What's the favorite place you've been to? This might be kind of tough for you, I would imagine.
You know, I get asked this question all the time, and I almost always have to say, okay, give me some qualifying statements here so that I can narrow it down. But, I lived on an uninhabited island for about 3 years on and off. There's a little ranger station on there, but it's a place called Cocos Island. It's 300 miles off the coast of Costa Rica. And every day I would swim out, a mile or two to photograph hammerhead sharks. And to me, that island is one of the most amazing places on the planet. There's not much going on shore, but as soon as you're in the water, it really is just another world. And you can have experiences that are hard to even imagine. You swim out there and there's a school of 1,000 hammerhead shark and they're just swimming around you, completely not aggressive at all. But it's an experience that it's really hard to relate anything that you can have on land to.
Wait a minute. Can we rewind to the word shark? So you're not in a cage, right? I mean, this is just you swimming out there and you're in the middle of this school of sharks.
Yeah, no cage necessary.
Wow.
Especially with a shark like hammerheads, obviously you don't jump in the water with something you don't understand. But I know that during the day and while they're schooling, they're typically not aggressive. And it's not the most aggressive shark species to begin with. So, having those understandings about it before you get in the water, the fear goes away.
I'll have to take your word for it because right now I can't imagine the fear going away, but you're the expert, so we'll trust you on that one. And what's the next place that you're traveling to?
I have a whole bunch of travel coming up in the next couple of weeks, but in a few days I'm driving down to northern Baja, just crossing the border around San Diego and driving down about an hour and a half. I'm going to be surfing and doing a photo shoot while I'm down there. And then there's actually, believe it or not, some great wine country just inland from there.
Oh, my goodness. Well, this would not be a good time to chat about this interview I just did with WCCO Radio in Minneapolis. The State Department has just issued a travel warning, an updated one for Mexico. One of the areas is Baja California. But if you can swim the sharks, I know you'll be safe.
I've driven through there a number of times. And, I have had to go down there to pick up a friend whose car got stolen. But that is by far the worst thing that I've ever encountered down there.
Wow. Listeners, Ben's website is benhorton.biz, benhorton.biz. On Twitter, you can find him at Ben Horton, on Facebook at Ben Horton NG, and on Instagram at Ben Horton Photo. And if you want to feel inadequate in your photo skills, just go to any one of those accounts, and you will be blown away at the quality of Ben's photography. And Ben, I do see, looking at your social media accounts, that you did go eclipse hunting with millions of other people here recently. I guess you couldn't resist such a celestial show, right?
I couldn't. Part of me really wanted to plan something extra special out, trying to photograph a person in the eclipse, with a long lens or something. But then I decided I just kind of wanted to have this experience and photograph it, but not really put too much effort into it. And now in hindsight, I kind of wish I would have just watched it,
Mm.
The photos are beautiful, but nothing compared to experiencing it.
Well, Ben, just mark your calendars. I think in, 7 years, right? 2024, we're going to have another total solar eclipse here in the U.S. I think it is.
And there's one in Argentina in 2019.
Oh, are we going?
I'm thinking about it.
Oh, really? Interesting. Listeners, you're going to have to keep tabs on his social media accounts to see if he ends up going there. Well, there was a photographer. Gosh, I wish I had it up right now. I don't. It was here in Washington, D.C., where we're based. And I have no idea how he did this. You probably do. But the photographer figured out the arc in the sky where the eclipse would be, and he set himself up at the base of the Washington Monument. And he stood exactly where, taking a time-lapse series of photos, that at the moment of most totality, we didn't have totality here in D.C., but I think it was about 70-80%. But at the spot where the sun was covered the most, it's at the exact top of the monument. And
Wow.
So you see 20 different images, and the central one at the very top of the Washington Monument is the most covered up. I have no idea how he figured out where to stand or where it would be in the arc in the sky, but it was really impressive.
It's not common for a photographer to tell people to go look at another photographer's work. But a friend of mine, his name's Ted Hesser, got by far the most incredible eclipse shot that I've seen yet. He managed to get the eclipse around a rock climber standing on top of this rock. And it's absolutely incredible. I think everybody should go check it out.
And tell us the name again.
Ted Hesser. So it's TEDHESSER. And that's his Instagram.
It must be the highest compliment that one photographer can give another, to refer people to go look at their work. So that's
there's no shame, in my opinion. I was surprised. So.
Well, now, beyond eclipse hunting, you also do storm chasing, I was noticing. And in fact, there's one image where you capture these really impressive lightning bolts in Zion, I think it was, out west.
Near Zion. It was actually just outside of Las Vegas on my way back from Zion.
Just really impressive. Did you know the storm was coming? You
Didn't.
Oh, you didn't?
No, I was actually driving back from Salt Lake City and decided to hike Angel's Landing in Zion on the way. And then for the next, maybe 3 hours of driving, there was a lightning bolt every 15 or 20 seconds. So I went to the best place that I could as the sun set, and I was probably up for 2 hours just photographing lightning bolts. And the hard part was stopping, because you never knew what the next one was going to be like.
Right. And so when you do that, when you're taking 2 hours to try to get the magic shot, the money shot, are you taking 500, 600 different images, and then you go through and you curate them and you delete 90% of them?
It really depends, because especially with a photo like a lightning shot, I don't know if you know how a lightning photo is typically taken, but you leave the shutter open and you keep the aperture small enough that it would be a black image if the lightning doesn't strike. But then the lightning striking it actually works like a flash. And so only that moment is exposed. So, I'm sitting out there leaving the shutter open for 15, 20, 30 seconds at a time. So I might have only come out of that with 80 pictures.
Wow. And actually, I noticed that in a lot of your photography, you like these long shutter exposures, right?
Yeah, that's my favorite, because it's, to me, when you're shooting in the dark with a shutter being left open and you're lighting things and moving around, to me it goes from just capturing a scene to creating something. It appeals to my artistic side.
Well, and it's almost as if you have painted water when you see some of your shots where you've left the shutter open and it's a waterfall or a fountain or the ocean or something. It just looks as though the water is painted on there.
Yeah, I love it when it gets this kind of foggy look, which is from just leaving it open for a long time.
Listeners, Ben was awarded National Geographic's first ever Young Explorer grant for his work. Obvious to see why. It was the first of several grants and assignments for the prestigious organization. Ben, when you get a new assignment, let's say from National Geographic, how do you go about planning for it and envisioning the mission in your mind?
Well, I'm going to let you in on all my secrets now.
This is great. Listeners, you get a pen and paper. This is an exclusive right here.
One of the first things that I do is I go to Google Earth and I just start clicking on the pictures on the map. And, you have right there at your fingertips a whole bunch of geotagged images from other people. They may not be professionally taken, but you can see, okay, at this point, this person was standing here and took this photo, and this is what they saw. I just went to Iceland, and that's how I selected most of the locations I wanted to go to. I had GPS coordinates for 90% of the things I wanted to see.
I was looking at your Iceland images, and they are stunning. We have a top travel tips in 2 minutes video for Iceland at voyagereport.com, listeners. But my photos, when I went with a buddy maybe 6 or 7 years ago, they don't look anything like your photos. I love a shot that you have of this ice cave. And what's sort of just as fascinating to me as how you took it is the story behind that, of how you basically outsmarted, I guess, about 100 tourists who were jammed into that cave at the same time you were, but you wanted a shot that was more natural. Can you take us behind that image and how that all happened?
Yeah. We had gone out there, paid an astronomical amount of money to get in this Unimog with huge tires that could get us out there. And, the way that they market it is that there's these ice caves and you hike around and you find one and then you go in. But the reality is there's one giant ice cave, at least in this location, and there's 10 different tour companies taking people in there. And there was at least 100 people inside this cave. And for about an hour, I just stood there watching people go by thinking, I'm not going to get the shot that I want. So I actually started to photograph the people, kind of telling the story of the reality of the ice cave situation. But then, I went all the way to the very back of the cave, and they started ushering everybody out to get back in the vans. And I waited and waited and waited until I was the very last person. I had preset everything, clicked the button, ran into the shot, and that's the photo that you end up seeing on my Instagram. Now, if I were to turn the camera around, you'd see 100 people. So, a photograph it can be a lie in a sense, but on the other hand, it can also show you, what this place would be like without the people, how we see it. Because when you're there, you're not thinking as much about the people unless you're a photographer. You're just amazed at the place that you're in. But when you're trying to inspire people with your images, it's hard to do that when it's crowded like that.
And why do you put yourself in an image like that? Is it to convey to the person viewing the photography the scale of your natural environment? Sometimes,
but to me, having a person in the picture lets the viewer place themselves there. So when I look at a picture and it's got a person in it, obviously if it's a close-up of their face, I'm not imagining that I'm them. But if you just see a person in a landscape, all of a sudden there's this three-dimensional thing to it. There's a story around the image. I don't really consider myself a landscape photographer, even though I work in these beautiful locations all the time. I consider myself more of an adventure photojournalist in a sense, because I try to take real situations as they're happening, unless I'm setting up an ice cave photo, and just give something to somebody where they can feel what it's like to be there. And personally, I think the reason I do that is because I want people to care about the planet, and giving them that experience that they might not have on their own. That's maybe the first step, is getting them to care.
Well, not only do I find that I care when I look at your photography, but I wish that I had won this massive Powerball jackpot so that I could afford to go to all these places where you've taken these amazing photos. Listeners, we're going to ask Ben a little bit later to give us his top tips for amateur photographers, which are most of us, that we can all use in our travels, whether it's a road trip or somewhere overseas or even a trip of a lifetime. Ben, speaking of adventure travel, you do give tips for great photography on a road trip through the Sierra Nevada mountains. How did that all come about, and can you share some of those tips with us?
Yeah. Well, I founded a company called Access Collective, and what we do is we take brands on real adventures. So instead of saying, hey, let's set up this big contrived advertising shoot, I say, how about you let me take your truck and I'm going to go with a friend. We're going to go on a real adventure, and we're excellent photographers and storytellers. So we're going to come back with photos that will tell the story of your product. So this trip was actually a trip that I did working with Toyota and Prana and Black Rapid. When I'm there on location, I'm just on an amazing trip taking photos. So every month or two, I just plan one of these trips and I go out and I just take a big adventure. And that's how this one came about. But you wanted to hear some of the tips for taking better photos?
Yeah, you had an article you published on, I think it was outdoorphotographer.com, and you mentioned to people your top recommendations and locations for a photo road trip through the Sierra Nevada, and I think a lot of people would be intrigued by that.
Yeah. So obviously Mount Whitney. I mean, it's the highest mountain in the lower 48. It's huge. And it's not just tall, it's really aesthetically pleasing. It's jagged. It has vertical rock faces that are, over 1,000 feet tall. So actually getting yourself a little bit of distance from it, being down in the Lone Pine area, photographing up towards Mount Whitney at sunrise and sunset is an amazing place to start. And right there is Alabama Hills, which looks really similar to Joshua Tree. So you can get these photos of what almost looks like a desert environment in front of one of the biggest mountains in the country. After that, I typically work my way north towards Bishop, and in and around Bishop, there's a lot of things that are good for like rock climbing or adventures, etc. But up in the mountains are the bristlecone pines, and these are the oldest trees we have on the planet, and they look like it. They look like they're from a different era. They're these stocky, just twisted and gnarly trees that, the ones that are alive have these typical pine needles on them, but then the ones that are dead are actually the most interesting to me. It almost looks like something out of like a haunted movie or something. And for me, the only way to go up there and shoot is if I'm going to get to take night photos, because the Milky Way is so clear behind it, and you just have these shapes that you don't typically get anywhere else. Not necessarily nearby. As the crow flies, it's pretty close, but it would take you about 5 hours drive. The sequoia trees are on the other side, and they're the biggest trees in the world. That's really hard to shoot, because how do you convey size with something that's that huge? And again, it's that putting the person in the photo so that you get this vicarious experience.
And I love what you did. You did that in one of your photos here. You have a lady, I hope you know who she is, but she's like 10 feet off the ground, and she's got her hands on one tree and her feet on the other, and she's spread between them. I mean, you totally get a sense of how massive these trees are.
Yeah, and it's funny because I look at that picture and I'm thinking, I still didn't show how massive these trees are.
Oh, they look huge. And how did you recruit her, by the way?
She's one of my best friends. We've been friends for 6 or 7 years now, and she's super adventurous and always down to go out and just do something fun. So I don't think it was so much a recruitment as much as just putting it out there, and she goes for it.
Is she the subject that we see in some of your Iceland photos, like at the Blue Lagoon?
No.
Oh, that's somebody else. Yeah, no, you have some great people that really, like you mentioned, they take us into the photo. Really impressive.
Yeah, I mean, finding the right subject is huge, because you could easily get out there with somebody that really doesn't enjoy being there or doesn't really have the comfort level to get in the position that you want them in for the photo. So I try to always set myself up for success by being with people that I know are going to be doing interesting things. And then we just go to an interesting place and the photos start to happen on their own.
Speaking of the mountains, you're from Colorado, I think, right?
I lived in Colorado from about 9 and a half into my early 20s. for the most part.
Yeah, so a good chunk of time. That's actually where my dad's from. And when I was a kid, we would go back every summer up to the Silt Mesa, there on the west side of the mountain near Grand Junction. And I would imagine that Colorado has some amazing vistas for photography. Do you get back there often?
Not as often as I'd like. I've been incredibly busy traveling for this last year, and I have managed to get back a couple times. Usually it's because I convince one of my clients that we should shoot in Colorado.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, why not, right?
I had a great shoot a couple of months, or sorry, I guess it was last winter, where, I actually got to convince the client that we should go stay at my mom's house in Edwards, Colorado.
Oh my gosh.
And I know the locations better than anybody out there. And we just went and explored for 3 days and shot the ad campaign for the company. So it was great.
Oh my goodness. Let's talk about exploration and storytelling. I mean, you mentioned a moment ago that you consider yourself a photojournalist. And so you are telling stories with your photography. We all know the saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. But when you frame an image in your viewfinder there, when you are blocking out a shot, how are you telling a story with your lens?
I like to layer my images. There's the foreground, the background, the subject, etc. But, you can layer an image with story as well. I'm going through this article that we're talking about the road trip through the Sierras. And I have a picture on here from Yosemite, and it's a person standing on top of the Lost Arrow Spire with the Yosemite Falls in the background and then the valley down below. And there's obviously story here. He's standing there, he's comfortable, but how did he get there? Thousands of feet up on top of a pinnacle separated from the wall by about 100 feet. So the mind goes through that, and the mind is what fills in those blanks. I think any good writer or storyteller knows how to leave some things up to the viewer or the reader. That's kind of how I think, and that's why I'm not a huge videographer, because a videographer shows a lot more, whereas a photographer, I think you give these key points and then you let the viewer fill in the rest.
In this particular photo that you're talking about, it really is stunning. You've got sun rays on one side of the shot, you've got a waterfall on the other, and then this beautiful mound of rock here is illuminated by the sun as well. Did you know this person, this model, or whoever it is on the top?
I did. He was a good friend of mine, and I climbed a lot of the things that I would call my greatest climbs with this guy. And the story of why we were there is actually really hilarious. He wanted to start an extreme wedding photography company. So he went and he got ordained so that he could actually marry people, and bought a couple wedding dresses. And he was walking through Yosemite with 2 wedding dresses, holding them up against girls. And then if they looked like they'd fit, he'd say, "Hey,
oh my gosh,
I want to take you up the Lost Arrow Spire and do this photo shoot up there of you having a pretend wedding." And we actually got 2 girls to go up there.
Wow. 2 girls that you didn't know?
Didn't know them. Just people walking around Camp 4 in Yosemite.
Unbelievable. Where are those shots? That would be great to see.
I think if you Google Yosemite wedding Lost Arrow Spire, I mean, they went super viral. Every big news agency was picking them up. It was kind of hilarious because I kept having to tell all these news agencies, it wasn't a real wedding.
Right. Amazing. Well, and this is a perfect segue into what I wanted to do next, which was play for our listeners this video clip that you have on your website. Listeners, if you go to his website and you search for it, it's called The Beach Teaser. But Ben, let's play a little bit for our listeners, and then we'll talk about it. This dovetails perfectly into what you were talking about hiking and climbing up these mountainsides. So let's take a listen here.
I'm traveling along Thailand's coastline, meeting tribes of devotees.
Beautiful.
To make a connection with them.
Bruce Lee and Bob Marley.
Whoa.
This is probably the best place in the world to climb limestone. Deepwater soloing, climbing without ropes, landing in water.
And to capture a portrait of life on the beach. as you've never seen it before.
Later, there's going to be 30,000 people here.
So, Ben, I saw you hanging off that cliff in this clip that we just saw. Does that give you an adrenaline rush? I mean, how do you focus on photography when you're trying to stay alive?
I definitely had an adrenaline rush. It's funny because as a rock climber, I'm actually a little bit afraid of heights, which I think,
oh, my goodness.
I think any good rock climber has a fear of heights. Otherwise, they're just reckless. But yeah, it's hard to think about photography sometimes, but I find that, I just kind of tell my brain to go into this computer mode where I set up a sequence of events that I want to happen in my mind. And then I kind of let my body on autopilot go through those things so that I can separate myself from it and just shoot. I tell myself, all right, in 3 seconds, I'm jumping off. This is how I'm going to do it. And then as my body's in autopilot, I'm photographing and I'm holding the camera, etc.
You are a braver man than I, Ben. That's really impressive. Listeners, we're talking to Ben Horton. He is a photographer and storyteller and shoots a lot with National Geographic. Let me ask you this. You describe yourself, your career, as being highlighted by contrasts. How so?
When I was first getting started, I got known because of shooting with the sharks in Cocos Island. That was my first big project with National Geographic. And then after that, in order to make a living, I started shooting fashion for many years. And, now I'm moving back into more adventure storytelling. And I like that. I like the fact that my career has not been one straight line of what I do. I get to jump around. I get to see, everything from dog sledding in the high Arctic to then going and shooting, bikini models on the beach somewhere for a swimsuit company. I have actually tried to move on more now into just taking my skills into the outdoors, into nature, and doing these adventure photo shoots because that's where my passion is. But the things that I've learned from shooting things that aren't necessarily my passion always find a way into the adventure photography that I do. I know how to frame up a person. I know how to make somebody look good. And that it really helps. If all I did was photograph landscapes, I wouldn't know how to photograph a person. So as far as a career goes, having this contrast has been really helpful.
So your background in fashion and your background in adventure photography perfectly melded for those wedding photos in Yosemite, right?
Yeah, so one of my agents at National Geographic said, we want to make you the guy that shoots beautiful people out doing fun, adventurous things. And this was for the commercial division at National Geographic. But what I was saying is, I think that the place is what makes a photo beautiful. You can shoot anybody out there and it'll look good. As long as you're in the right place at the right time with somebody that's willing to be adventurous, you're going to get amazing photos.
Well, you don't have to worry really about dressing the set when you're outside. I mean, nature has sort of done that for you, right?
No, exactly. And, it's kind of hard to take credit for an amazing landscape. It's pretty whether I was there or not.
Yes, but you captured it in a way that seized our imagination, and that's quite something. Listeners, in a few minutes, we're going to ask Ben for his top tips for us amateur photographers and what we can do to make our images better. Images like one of my favorites of Ben's, which is a photo of a Mongolian horseman riding through a fog bank in Mongolia. It is such a mysterious photo. Ben, what story are you trying to tell in that image?
Well, let me tell you the story behind the image, and we'll see if it comes through. I had just ridden for 12 hours across these mountains in Mongolia. I was supposed to be picked up in 2 hours by a car, but the car had gotten stuck. So I didn't have food. I didn't have water. The Mongolians didn't have food or water either, but I think they're a little bit tougher than me. And it was just this torrential downpour for most of the time. And then as soon as the rain stopped, these horseflies came out, and I was covered head to toe with a jacket and gloves, but it was 95 degrees out. And this was maybe the last 2 miles of an all-day ride to get to the boundary area where we would actually be able to find some of the Mongolian nomads that live in gers, is what they're called. And the horses were galloping through the scene because of the flies. They were trying to outrun them. And, I was exhausted, but I saw this happening. I just had to get my horse off the road and kind of into the trees. And I'd let go of the reins and was just photographing while my horse was galloping on his own. Honestly, I don't think I needed to direct the horse at all. He knew where he was going. But, that photo to me, it captures all of what I was going through on that day. And that can actually be something that I struggle with photography, is you see something and you have your memories about the experience. But when somebody else looks at that photo, they don't have those memories or those feelings that you are conjuring up. So, a good photo tells a story with or without the background. And that's what I think this photo does.
It's very impressive, and I was taken with it. And it's one of those photos, listeners, if you look it up, where you just sort of have to stop and you admire it, you imagine being there, and it just sort of seizes your imagination for a few minutes. It's really impressive. Ben, I've been curious to know from a professional photographer about this. How have drones changed photography?
They have opened up a new way to take pictures, for sure. I've written quite a bit about drone photography because I incorporate it into a lot of the shoots that I do. But just like when the GoPro first came out, photography changed, right? All of a sudden, you could have this tiny camera that would go anywhere. You could put it underwater. You could put it on the end of a pole. And all these angles that you couldn't get with a typical DSLR camera that weighed 10 pounds were suddenly available to you. Well, that's what drones have done. A lot of people are still shooting mostly video on drones, but I like to use them for still photography because you get these angles that you might not ever get in any other way. Unless you rented a helicopter, you're not going to get these angles. And sometimes a helicopter wouldn't even be able to go where you can put a drone. But at the same time, they're loud, they're obnoxious, and, not always the most natural experience that you can have. So I try to, if there's other people around, if I'm somewhere that it just doesn't feel right, I won't fly the drone.
I think there's one shot, I can't remember where it's from, but I saw, I think you used a drone, but it's basically I think it's a man and his dog walking through a desert or a beach or something, and it's from above, and you see, you're directly above them, so they are little specks, but their shadows stretch out into the frame, and it's really impressive.
That's one of the things that I like to do with drones is work with the shadows rather than the subject. I don't know if you've seen the photo of the surfer from above.
No, I haven't.
It's a surfer standing looking out over the waves, and it's actually me. I'm flying the drone myself, taking a photo of myself.
While surfing?
Yeah, I'm not actually surfing yet. I'm standing on the beach looking out over the waves. But you can't really tell much about me until you look at the shadow, and the shadow is just, the sun was in the perfect place to have the shadow line up and be the right size in the image. And it's absolutely one of my favorite images because it's less direct. I think, photography gets really amazing when you can make it artistic, and it's hard to do sometimes when you're just pointing the camera and taking a picture, but thinking of other ways to see things is what I'm always trying to do. And that's what photographing the shadows in those images, that's what that was.
All right, listeners, we are talking with a master photographer, so let's get his advice. Pay attention now. We're going to ask Ben for his top tips for us amateurs. So, Ben, what tips can you share of how we can all take better photos?
I think the number one thing that you can do when you're trying to take a better photo is to not think about what you're including in the photo, but think about what you're taking out of it. Simplify the photo, break it down to the elements that matter, and if it doesn't matter, take it out. I like to use landscapes more as, to think of them in terms of shapes. And then, the person in the photo is a shape. Sometimes I even blur my eyes when I'm looking at a scene just to get a feel for how these shapes line up with each other. But then the second thing that I would say, which might be more important, is just to show people how you see the world. Because that's what we're doing with photography, is we're showing people something that we're seeing and how we're seeing it. And the settings on the camera, how you frame it, all of that is just, it's a way for you to filter it down and show somebody something that they've never seen before, even if they're standing right next to you. And that's what the world looks like through your eyes. If you can do that, you're going to be giving somebody a unique experience. And that's going to make the photo interesting to them.
And do we need a $5,000 camera?
Absolutely not. In fact, I just bought a $600 camera because it's small and I can take it anywhere with me. The most important thing is the lens that you're using. I mean, obviously, a lot of photographers love to say that it's not the camera, it's the photographer. But if you're going to be using a camera, the lens that you're using is the most important part. The camera just records the image, but it's the lens that makes the image. So getting the right lens on your camera that you can point it into the sun and it doesn't just blow the whole scene out, or, that is just the right angle of view so that it's not too wide, not too narrow. That's one of the most important things you can do. And you can shoot it with an iPhone. If the subject is good enough, the camera doesn't matter.
And I can hear our listeners screaming for me to ask you, what is this $600 camera that you just bought?
I almost don't want to say, but nobody's paying me to represent cameras, but it's a great camera. It's the little Sony a6300. They came out with a new one that's the a6500, but I didn't see any reason why it was going to be more valuable to me than the older version, which I could get for cheaper. And I know I'm not the only professional photographer that has one of those in his kit. I mean, it's so small. It's incredible.
With a detachable lens.
Yeah, it has a detachable lens, and I even got an adapter so I could use my much higher quality Canon lenses on that camera.
And I was just going to ask, Canon or Nikon, but you've answered the question there, right?
You know what? They're all great. You can pick whatever brand you want, and it's not going to keep you from getting amazing photos.
And what is your workhorse camera?
Canon, a 5D Mark III. Sometimes I use a Mark IV. And if I'm shooting stars, I use the 5DS.
On your Facebook page, one of your posts shows one of your striking photos on somebody's wall. And it was really interesting to me because you said in the post that you called it an honor when someone wanted to display your work in their home or their office. What goes through your mind when someone tells you, hey, Ben, I want to buy this photo, frame it, and put it up in my home?
It really is, to me, it's an honor, because to think that I have taken something that somebody wants to look at every day. I will always be amazed that people admire my work that much, and not admire me, but just like that scene, that thing that I captured, that gives them a feeling that they want every day. Yeah, to me, just seeing somebody put my work on their wall, I have this huge sense of pride, because it's the same thing as when I cook dinner for somebody. I'm always thinking about what's wrong with it. I taste the food and I think it's terrible, and then they taste the food and they think it's great, because they aren't the ones thinking about all the little details, the things they could have done better. There's very few photos that I've taken that I look at and I think I wouldn't have changed a thing. In fact, I can't even think of one. But seeing your work in print is one of the most rewarding experiences you can have as a photographer, especially when it's a big print on somebody's wall.
And listeners, now you've just learned how photography is like cooking. All here on this podcast. Well, listeners, if you want to check out Ben's amazing work, again, his website, benhorton.biz, benhorton.biz. On Twitter, you can find him at Ben Horton. On Facebook, Ben Horton NG. And on Instagram, at Ben Horton Photo. Ben, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your tips with us here at the Voyage Report. It's been a fascinating conversation, and we sure appreciate your time.
Yeah, it was an honor to be here, and thanks for making me think through some of those questions. It's always good to have a different viewpoint.
Well, we try to ask the tough questions here, and we get paid by the questions, so we just keep asking them at all. Listeners, are you going to use Ben's tips on your next trip? Are you inspired now to take more photographs? Let us know by rating this podcast, giving us a review, and sharing it on social media. We have guests every week talking about travel news and trends, so be sure to subscribe to our podcast. We'd sure appreciate your review. It helps bring more awareness to our journalism and original content. And if you have an idea for a future guest on our podcast, please reach out at voyagereport.com and let us know. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Mark Albert. Bon voyage.
You've been listening to the Voyage Report podcast. Get the scoop on travel at voyagereport.com.